Maria Santos had always been different from other girls in her small mountain village. While her friends played with dolls, she was learning to shoot cans off fence posts with her grandfather's old hunting rifle. Her father, a former military man, taught her that a weapon was only as good as the person holding it. But what he really wanted her to understand was that true strength came from within. The 28-year-old woman worked as a park ranger in the remote wilderness of Colorado. Her job required her to patrol thousands of acres of rugged terrain, checking on hikers, monitoring wildlife, and ensuring campers followed safety rules. Most days were peaceful, filled with the sounds of nature and the satisfaction of protecting something beautiful. Maria loved the solitude and the responsibility that came with her uniform. Her reputation among fellow rangers was solid. She could track a wounded animal for miles, rappel down cliff faces to rescue stranded climbers, and navigate through dense forest in complete darkness. The rifle she carried wasn't just standard equipment, it was an extension of herself. She had qualified as an expert marksman every year for the past 6 years, something that earned respect from even the most experienced male rangers. Maria's daily routine started before dawn. She would check her equipment, review weather reports, and plan her patrol routes. The rifle was always cleaned and ready, secured in the rack of her ranger truck. She had never drawn it on another human being, though she had used it twice to scare off aggressive bears and once to put down a severely injured elk. The weight of it felt natural in her hands, like a familiar tool rather than a weapon. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, Maria noticed something unusual during her equipment check. 5 men in expensive hiking gear were setting up camp in an area that required special permits. Their equipment looked brand new, the kind that screamed money rather than experience. Something about their behavior seemed off. They were too alert, too organized for casual hikers. When she approached to check their permits, they became defensive and evasive. The men claimed they were just enjoying nature, but Maria's instincts told her otherwise. Their leader, a tall man with cold eyes and expensive boots, spoke with barely concealed irritation. His companions watched her every move, their hands never straying far from their backpacks. She noticed they had positioned themselves strategically, around the campsite, like soldiers rather than tourists. After checking their falsified permits, Maria radioed for backup and prepared to escort them out of the restricted area. It was supposed to be a routine enforcement action, the kind she had handled dozens of times before. She had no idea that these men were part of an illegal hunting ring that had been poaching rare wildlife for wealthy collectors. They had already killed 2 endangered mountain lions and were planning to take down a protected elk herd that afternoon. As Maria walked back toward her truck to get the citation book, she felt the familiar weight of her rifle across her shoulder. The morning sun was getting stronger, and she could hear birds singing in the distance. Everything seemed normal, but her training had taught her to trust her gut feelings. Something was very wrong with this situation, and she was about to find out just how wrong things could get. The men watched her every step, exchanging glances and subtle hand signals. They had invested too much money and taken too many risks to let one park ranger ruin their operation. Their leader made a decision that would change everything. As Maria reached for her radio to call in the false permits, she heard footsteps, moving quickly behind her. Her hand instinctively moved toward her rifle, but she was already too late. Before she could react, rough hands grabbed her from behind while another man lunged for her weapon. The ambush was swift and coordinated, clearly planned from the moment she had approached their camp. Maria felt her rifle being ripped away from her shoulder as strong arms pinned her against her truck. In that moment, she realized these weren't just permit violators. They were dangerous criminals who would do anything to avoid getting caught. The moment her rifle left her hands, Maria knew she was in serious trouble. The 5 men surrounded her like a pack of wolves, their friendly hiker masks dropping to reveal something much more sinister. Their leader, the one with cold eyes, held her confiscated rifle with practiced ease. He wasn't just some rich tourist playing at being outdoorsy. He handled the weapon like someone with real training. "You picked the wrong day to be a hero, Ranger girl," he said, his voice carrying a threatening edge that made Maria's blood run cold. The other 4 men spread out around her truck, blocking any escape routes. She could see they were experienced at this kind of intimidation, moving with the coordination of people who had worked together before. This wasn't their first time dealing with law enforcement. Maria tried to reach for her radio, but one of the men grabbed her wrist with crushing force. Another man, shorter but built like a wrestler, stepped forward and yanked the radio from her belt, throwing it hard against a nearby rock. The plastic casing shattered, taking her last connection to the outside world with it. She was now completely alone in the wilderness, with 5 dangerous criminals. "Here's what's going to happen," the leader continued, pointing her own rifle at her chest. "You're going to forget you ever saw us. You're going to drive back to your little ranger station and file a report about finding an empty campsite. No permits, no violations, no suspicious activity, just another boring day in paradise." His finger rested on the trigger with casual confidence. Maria's mind raced through her options. She was outnumbered 5-1, disarmed, and miles from the nearest help. Her truck keys were in her pocket, but even if she could reach them, these men could easily shoot out her tires or worse. Running into the dense forest might give her cover, but they obviously knew these woods well enough to set up an illegal operation here. She had to be smart about this. The shortest man stepped closer, invading her personal space with an ugly grin. "Maybe we should make sure she really understands the situation," he suggested, his intentions clear from his leering expression. The others laughed in agreement, clearly enjoying having power over someone who had been in authority just minutes before. Maria realized they weren't just poachers, they were predators in every sense of the word. "You boys are making a big mistake," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Years of dealing with dangerous wildlife had taught her that showing fear could trigger an attack. "I've already radioed my location to dispatch. Other rangers will be here within the hour." It was a bluff, but she delivered it with convincing authority. The leader's expression darkened. He stepped forward and pressed the barrel of her rifle against her forehead. "Nice try, sweetheart, but we've been monitoring radio frequencies all morning. Nobody knows you're here and nobody's coming to help you." His knowledge of police procedures confirmed Maria's worst fears. These weren't random criminals. They were organized and prepared. One of the other men, wearing expensive camouflage gear, pulled out a hunting knife with a serrated edge. "Maybe we should cut her up a little, make sure she gets the message," he said, testing the blade against his thumb. Blood beaded on his skin, but he smiled like he enjoyed the pain. Maria could see these men had crossed lines before and wouldn't hesitate to cross more. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Maria knew that once criminals decided to hurt a law enforcement officer, they rarely stopped halfway. They would either have to let her go completely, which seemed unlikely given what she had witnessed, or they would have to make sure she could never testify against them. The math was simple and terrifying. As the men closed in around her, Maria felt something shift inside her mind. The fear was still there, but it was being pushed aside by something else. The cold, calculating fury her father had taught her to harness during her childhood training. He had always told her that when words failed and weapons weren't available, she would have to rely on the most dangerous weapon of all, her own determination to survive no matter what the cost. The man with the knife moved closer, clearly enjoying the fear he thought he saw in Maria's eyes. What he actually saw was something far more dangerous, the focused calm of someone who had just accepted that violence was inevitable. Maria had spent years studying predator behavior, and she recognized the signs in these men. They had moved past intimidation into the territory where they would have to hurt her to feel satisfied. "You know what I think?" the knife-wielding man said, pressing the blade against her uniform shirt. "I think this little ranger needs to learn some respect for her betters." The fabric parted slightly under the razor-sharp edge, and Maria felt the cold metal against her skin. The other men laughed and moved in closer, forming a tight circle that blocked out most of the morning sunlight. Maria's father had been a combat veteran who understood that violence was sometimes the only language certain people spoke. He had taught her that when facing multiple attackers, the key was to strike fast, strike hard, and never give them a chance to recover. "If you have to fight," he had told her, "make sure you're the only one still standing when it's over." Those Words echoed in her mind as she felt the knife bite deeper. The leader with her rifle was getting impatient. "Enough playing around," he barked at his companions. "We need to move our operation before more rangers show up." He looked at Maria with dead eyes that had clearly seen violence before. "Take care of her quickly, then we'll dump the body where the bears will find it. Make it look like an animal attack." Hearing her death sentence spoken so casually triggered something primal in Maria's nervous system. Her father had called it combat mode, the state where time seemed to slow down and every detail became crystal clear. She could see the exact angle of the knife, the positioning of each man's feet, the way the leader's grip had relaxed slightly on her rifle. Everything was happening in slow motion, giving her mind time to calculate and plan. The shortest man, the wrestler type who had grabbed her wrist earlier, reached out to pin her arms while his friend worked with the knife. This was the moment Maria had been waiting for, the instant when they stopped treating her as a potential threat and started treating her as a victim. It was the last mistake they would make. Maria had been trained in hand-to-hand combat as part of her ranger certification, but her real education had come from her father's brutal after-school sessions. He had taught her that fighting wasn't about being stronger or bigger. It was about being more committed to winning than your opponent was. It was about accepting pain as the price of survival and being willing to inflict whatever damage was necessary. As the short man's hands closed, on her arms Maria exploded into motion with a speed that caught all 5 men completely off guard. Her right elbow drove backward into the knife man's solar plexus with enough force to lift him off his feet. The blade flew from his hands as he doubled over, gasping for air that wouldn't come. At the same time, her left hand grabbed the short man's wrist and twisted with all her strength. Feeling bones snap under the pressure, the short man's scream of pain broke the morning silence like a gunshot. He stumbled backward, cradling his broken wrist against his chest, his face white with shock and agony. The knife man was still doubled over, making horrible wheezing sounds as he struggled to breathe. In less than 2 seconds, Maria had gone, from helpless victim to dangerous opponent. The remaining 3 men stared in stunned disbelief. They had expected a terrified park ranger to beg for mercy, not a trained fighter who moved like lightning and struck with deadly precision. Their leader still held her rifle, but he was standing too close to use it effectively. The other 2 men were reaching for weapons of their own, but they were moving too slowly, still processing what had just happened. Maria didn't give them time to recover from their shock. She had learned from her father that momentum was everything in a fight. Once you started winning, you had to keep pushing until every threat was eliminated. Hesitation meant death, and these men had already proven they were willing to kill her. Now it was time to find out if they were willing to die for their illegal hunting operation. The leader tried to bring Maria's rifle up to firing position, but she was already inside his guard. Years of close-quarters combat training kicked in as she grabbed the barrel with her left hand and drove her right fist into his throat with surgical precision. The blow crushed his windpipe, sending him stumbling backward with a horrible gurgling sound. The rifle clattered to the ground between them. One of the remaining men, wearing an expensive hunting vest, pulled a large hunting knife from his belt and lunged at Maria's back. She spun around just in time, catching his wrist as the blade came down toward her shoulder. Using his own momentum against him, she twisted his arm and drove her knee up into his elbow joint with bone-crushing force. The sickening crack of breaking bone echoed through the forest. The man screamed and dropped his knife, his arm now bent at an impossible angle. But Maria wasn't finished with him. Her father had taught her that in a life-or-death fight, you never left an enemy capable of coming back at you later. She grabbed him by his expensive vest and drove her forehead into his nose with devastating impact. Blood exploded across his face as he collapsed unconscious to the ground. The 5th man, who had been hanging back during the initial confrontation, now realized he was facing something beyond his experience. This wasn't the helpless park ranger they had planned to intimidate and eliminate. This was a trained killer who moved with deadly efficiency. He turned to run toward their camp, probably hoping to reach whatever weapons they had stashed there. Maria couldn't let him escape. If even one of these men got away, he could come back with reinforcements or simply disappear into the criminal underground. She had already crossed the line into lethal force. There was no turning back now. She sprinted after the fleeing, man, her ranger training giving her speed and endurance that his expensive gear couldn't match. She tackled him from behind just as he reached their campsite, sending both of them crashing into their illegal hunting equipment. Expensive rifles and ammunition scattered across the ground, along with evidence of their poaching operation, radio collars from protected animals, photographs of trophy kills, and detailed maps of ranger patrol routes. These men were professional, wildlife criminals operating on a massive scale. The tackled man tried to crawl toward a pistol that had fallen from one of their bags, but Maria was faster. She grabbed his ankle and yanked him backward, then flipped him over and drove her knee into his stomach with crushing force. He doubled over in agony, all fight knocked out of him. She grabbed the pistol and threw it deep into the forest where it would never be found. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the other men trying to recover from their injuries. The leader was still making choking sounds, his damaged throat preventing him from calling for help. The short man with the broken wrist was crying and cursing, completely out of the fight. The knife man was slowly getting his breath back, but seemed afraid to make any sudden moves. Maria stood in the center of their destroyed campsite, surrounded by 5 men who had underestimated her in the worst possible way. Her uniform was torn and dirty. Her knuckles were bleeding and her heart was pounding with adrenaline, but she was very much alive. More importantly, she was now the one in control of the situation. The entire confrontation had lasted exactly 83 seconds, though it felt like hours to Maria. From the moment the first man had touched her to the final takedown at their campsite, she had moved through the fight like a force of nature. Her father's training had taken over completely, turning her into exactly the kind of weapon he had always known she could become. Now came the hard part, deciding what to do with 5 dangerous criminals who had tried to kill a law enforcement officer. They were miles from civilization. Her radio was destroyed, and these men had already proven they would do anything to avoid justice. Maria picked up her rifle from where the leader had dropped it and checked to make sure it was still loaded. The weight felt good in her hands again, like everything was back where it belonged. Maria stood over the 5 defeated men, her rifle ready but no longer needed. The leader was still alive but barely conscious, his damaged throat making every breath a struggle. The others were in various states of injury and shock, finally understanding that they had picked the wrong target for their violent intimidation tactics. What had started as routine permit checking had become something much more serious. As she surveyed the scene, Maria began to piece together the full scope of their illegal operation. Their campsite contained enough evidence to put them away for years. Professional poaching equipment, photographs of protected wildlife they had killed, detailed maps showing ranger patrol schedules, and communication equipment for coordinating with buyers. These weren't casual hunters gone wrong. They were organized criminals running a sophisticated wildlife trafficking ring. The short man with the broken wrist was the first to try talking his way out of the situation. "Look, lady, we can work something out here," he wheezed, cradling his injured arm. "We've got money, lots of it. You could retire tomorrow if you just walk away from this." His offer confirmed what Maria already suspected. They had wealthy clients paying premium prices for illegal trophy animals. Maria ignored his desperate bargaining and began securing their weapons and equipment. She used their own rope and zip ties to bind their hands, making sure the restraints were tight enough to prevent escape but not so tight as to cause permanent damage. Her ranger training included basic first aid, and she knew she had a responsibility to keep them alive until proper authorities could take over. The knife man, who had been the most threatening during the initial confrontation, was now pleading for medical attention. "I think you broke my ribs," he gasped, holding his chest where her elbow had connected. "I need a hospital." Maria felt no sympathy for him. He had been ready to torture and kill her just minutes earlier. His injuries were the direct result of his own violent choices. While she worked, Maria's mind was already planning her next moves. Her truck still had fuel, and she knew these mountain roads well enough to navigate to the nearest ranger station, even without radio contact. The evidence at their campsite would be crucial for prosecution, so she began documenting everything with her personal camera. Every photograph could be the difference between conviction and acquittal. The leader finally managed to speak, his voice a harsh whisper through his damaged throat. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into," he croaked. "We work for people, with serious money and serious connections. They'll make you disappear for interfering with their business." Even defeated and injured, he was still trying to intimidate her with threats. Maria knelt down beside him, her rifle across her knees, and her voice deadly calm. "Let me explain something to you," she said quietly. "I'm a federal law enforcement officer, and you just assaulted me with intent to commit murder. Whatever connections you think you have won't matter when the FBI gets involved. You're going to federal prison for a very long time." She could see the reality of his situation, finally sinking into his eyes. Federal charges for assaulting a park ranger carried mandatory minimum sentences that even expensive lawyers couldn't make disappear. Add in the wildlife trafficking, the illegal weapons, and the attempted murder, and these men were looking at decades behind bars. Their profitable poaching operation was over. As Maria finished documenting the evidence, she heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoing through the mountains. Her supervisor at the ranger station must have become concerned when she failed to check in and dispatched a search team. The cavalry was finally coming, but she no longer needed rescue. She had handled the situation herself using skills her father had taught her years ago. The helicopter sound grew louder, and Maria could see it approaching through the trees. She waved her arms to signal her location, then stood back to watch, as backup finally arrived. In a few minutes, these mountains would be crawling with law enforcement officers, federal agents, and medical personnel. The quiet morning had turned into the biggest criminal bust in the region's history, but Maria felt no satisfaction in her victory, only relief that she had survived and prevented these criminals from continuing their destructive operation. She had been forced to use violence to defend herself, but she had done exactly what her training and her conscience demanded. Sometimes protecting the things you loved required being willing to fight for them with everything you had. The FBI helicopters landed in a whirlwind of dust and rotor noise, disgorging federal agents who had been tracking this poaching ring for months. Special Agent Sarah Chen, the lead investigator, surveyed the scene with professional amazement. 5 dangerous criminals were secured and defeated, their entire operation exposed and documented, all by a single park ranger who had stumbled into their illegal campsite. Maria spent the next 6 hours giving detailed statements to multiple agencies. The evidence she had preserved was exactly what federal prosecutors needed to build an airtight case against the entire wildlife trafficking network. Her photographs, the confiscated equipment, and her professional testimony would help bring down not just these 5 men, but their wealthy clients and international contacts as well. The medical evaluation revealed the full extent of what Maria had accomplished in those 83 seconds. The leader required emergency surgery to repair his crushed windpipe. The short man needed pins in his shattered wrist bones. The knife man had 3 broken ribs and severe internal bruising. The others had concussions and various injuries that would take weeks to heal. All 5 would recover, but they would carry permanent reminders of their encounter with the wrong park ranger. During the investigation, agents discovered that this group had been responsible for killing over 40 protected animals in the past 2 years. They had clients in Europe and Asia willing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for illegal trophies from American wildlife preserves. Their operation had generated millions in profits while devastating local ecosystems and endangered species populations. Maria's supervisor, Ranger Captain Mike Rodriguez, arrived at the scene as the last of the evidence was being loaded into federal vehicles. He had worked with Maria for 5 years and knew her capabilities, but even he was impressed by how she had handled an impossible situation. "You did everything right," he told her quietly. "Your father would be proud of how you used his training." The UN media attention was intense but brief. Maria refused most interview requests, preferring to let her official reports speak for themselves. She had no interest in becoming famous for defending herself against criminals. The story that emerged focused on her professional competence and the successful dismantling of a major poaching ring, rather than sensationalizing the violence that had been necessary. 3 months later, all 5 men pleaded guilty to federal charges rather than face trial and longer sentences. The leader received 25 years without parole. The others got sentences ranging from 12 to 18 years. Their cooperation led to arrests of their clients and suppliers across 3 continents, effectively destroying one of the largest illegal wildlife trade networks in North America. Maria returned to her regular duties as a park ranger, but with enhanced respect from her colleagues and updated security protocols for remote patrols. She carried the same rifle and worked the same territory, but now other rangers knew exactly what she was capable of when pushed to her limits. The mountains felt safer knowing she was out there protecting them. The psychological evaluation required. After any use of force incident showed that Maria had processed the trauma in a healthy way. She felt no guilt about defending herself against armed criminals who had intended to kill her. Her father's training had not only saved her life, but had also prepared her mentally for the aftermath of violence. She slept well at night, knowing she had done her duty. On quiet mornings when Maria patrolled the same area where the confrontation had occurred, she sometimes reflected on those 83 seconds that had changed everything. She had discovered that when everything was stripped away, her radio, her rifle, her backup, her advantages, she still had the most important tool of all, the determination to survive and protect what mattered to her. The wilderness was peaceful again, home to the animals and natural beauty that Maria had dedicated her life to preserving. The poachers were gone, their clients were facing prosecution, and the illegal trade network they had built was in ruins. Sometimes the best way to protect something beautiful was to be absolutely ruthless with those who would destroy it. Maria understood that lesson better than most, and the mountains were safer because of what she was willing to do when words and warnings weren't enough.